Here in chapter 13, we're going to be talking about the brain as far as the structures, the parts, and the functions of those parts, as well as some of the cranial nerves. So first of all, the function and the development of the brain. So we already covered action potentials and what the brain and central nervous and peripheral nervous, we've already covered those before. So essentially here focusing on the central nervous system, so again, the brain and the spinal cord, there are four main divisions of it. So we have the brain stem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and then the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is the biggest part. That's mainly what we think about with the brain, but all these other parts are included as well. And this is showing the regions of the brain. So anterior, so the front close to our forehead. So again, the biggest part here being the cerebrum. It's not just this one part, it's the majority of the brain that we're looking at. And then there's a small region called the diencephalon. So in the middle, essentially, of the brain and kind of tucked away very much in the middle, we have the diencephalon, and we'll talk more about the parts, but it includes the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And then we have the brain stem, and so that's this region underneath that diencephalon. So again, the cerebrum is all of this out here. We have the small region here, the diencephalon. Below that, we have the brain stem, and it's made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And then finally, the little part here that looks kind of like a bush or a tree is our cerebellum. Now, what are all these parts doing? So there's a nice little summary table here that the book provides. So if we look at the divisions and what they do, which is what we're focusing on, so the brainstem region, so again, the brainstem is this region here that's made up of the medulla, the pons, and the brain. So the whole brainstem essentially connects the spinal cord to the cerebrum. So it's that connection point. Again, it's made up of those parts. Also, we include the reticular formation. We'll come back to that one that's on here. And its main functions are going to be listed in each of the following ones. So the medulla, so it's going both up and down, so ascending and descending nerve tracts, but really what is important here are a lot of different reflexes, and that includes our heart rate, breathing, swallowing. So a lot of reflexes are controlled here by the medulla. Then our pons, which is kind of the little bubble portion that sticks out there. Again, it's going up and down, but it's a relay kind of station. So it relays information between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. We also have some reflex centers there as well. And then finally, the midbrain, again, has nerves going up and down. It's a visual reflex center and also part of our auditory pathway. Then this reticular formation, this is actually scattered throughout the brainstem, so it's not just one little part of it, but it contains many of the activities. So it includes motor controls, some pain perception, rhythmic contractions, and our sleep-wake cycle. Then if we move into the cerebellum, kind of that little bush tree-like little structure, this controls muscle movement and tone, so kind of our coordination, our balance that's included there, as well as our intentional movements and our learning of motor skills. The diencephalon, and again, it's made up, we already mentioned the thalamus and hypothalamus, but two additional ones, the subthalamus and the epithalamus. So again, all related to the thalamus. They make up this diencephalon, and this connects the brainstem to the cerebrum. So again, it helps with relay and homeostatic functions. Specifically, the thalamus, again, relay center, but also is involved in mood and movement. The subthalamus, we have some nerve tracts and nuclei that we'll talk more about. The epithalamus, again, this is involved in motivation and reward, also includes the pineal gland. And then the hypothalamus, this is a lot of our homeostatic and our endocrine, so a lot of our hormones are regulated through the hypothalamus. Then the cerebrum, again, the biggest part of our brain, our central nervous system here. So it controls perceptions, our thoughts, our memories, emotions, conscious motor behavior, and can override most of the other systems. So some of the main parts that we talk about here, the cerebral cortex, this is most of our sensory motor and association areas, the hippocampus that's involved in learning and memory. The amygdala is involved in our social behavior and emotions. And then the basal nuclei, this controls muscle activity and postures and also inhibits unintentional movements when we're at rest, so we're not like jerking and everything can kind of relax. Now, what about the formation of the brain? So just a little bit about that. First of all, what's called the neural tube is going to form early during development, and it ultimately gives rise to the central nervous system, which is why we're talking about it. So what it's made up of initially are what are called neural folds. Those are going to fuse together. So essentially, during embryonic development, we get what's called a neural plate that's made up of ectodermal tissue. That's developing in the embryo. And just ventral to that neural plate, we have what's called the notochord. So we can see again here, this neural plate here, and then the notochord that we see. So as it continues, what's going to happen are the lateral sides become elevated. So they're essentially moving up here, and that creates this this divot that's forming between them. So as those folds move upward, it creates this, again, neural fold. And ultimately, those are going to continue to move up until the folds form what's called the neural crest. So here's our neural crest. And as eventually those neural crest cells migrate away, and it gives rise to all of the sensory, autonomic, and enteric neurons of the peripheral nervous system. And then finally, those neural folds are going to move toward each other. They fuse and create, or fuse and then close off to create this neural tube that's here. And again, the notochord is there as well. Now, the development of the brain segments. So the forebrain which is divided into the diencephalon and telencephalon. That's what ultimately becomes the cerebrum, which is why we didn't mention it before. So what's going to happen are the pouches develop in that neural tube and they form these regions. So then the midbrain, again, remains a single structure, and then the hindbrain develops into what's called the metencephalon that becomes the pons and cerebellum, and then the myelencephalon that becomes the medulla. So that's going to form that midbrain. Right. Excuse me, and this is just showing that. So again, the early embryo neural development happens pretty quickly. So we have the forebrain here that develops ultimately into the cerebrum, and the diencephalon. Midbrain comes from the mesencephalon, and then the hindbrain is going to give rise to that brainstem region. All right, so now, again, this is just kind of a summary figure here about how this happens. Again, forebrain ultimately becomes the cerebrum and diencephalon, midbrain, or the mesencephalon, and then the hindbrain is going to make up the pons, the cerebellum, and then also the medulla. All right, now if we look more at what these parts of the brain are doing. So if we start with the brainstem, again, this connects the spinal cord to the base of the brain. We have the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain, and then also, again, the reticular formations that move throughout. So it's involved, again, in a lot of our essential and autonomic, so again, reflex actions that are necessary for survival. All right, now what the diencephalon and the brainstem look like. Again, the diencephalon has our thalamus here in the hypothalamus, all those other subsections as well, and then also the pineal gland that's there. Then we get into the midbrain. It's in this region. Again, our pons kind of sticks out there like a bubble, and then the medulla oblongata that is oblong, and one on each side that make up our brainstem. Now, our cranial nerves, and we'll come back to these later at the end of the chapter. We have multiple cranial nerves that are going to be coming off the diencephalon and the brainstem, and we'll be talking about each of them and what they do. So there are 12 cranial nerves, and they are all coming off of this region that's mainly found in the brainstem. Now the medulla, this is the most inferior, so in the bottom part there, it has nuclei, which again are those clusters, that internal gray matter that we covered in the previous chapter. So this is involved in regulating heart rate, vasodilation or constriction, our breathing, swallowing, vomiting, hiccuping, coughing, and sneezing. So again, a lot of reflexes. There are what are called pyramids, which are descending nerve tracts, and then inferior leaf fibers that are called dessicates. So this half of the brain controls what's happening in the opposite half of the body. And then there are also structures called olives that are rounded, so they look like olives. They protrude on the anterior surface. And these are nuclei within those olives regulate balance, coordination, modulation of sound from that inner ear. Then our pons, again, just above the medulla, some of the nuclei that are in there, we have the pontine nuclei. This relays information between the cerebrum and cerebellum. The sleep center is involved here, as well as the respiratory center that gets controlled here in the medulla. Then the midbrain, again, that mesencephalon that we mentioned earlier, just above the pons. So we have quite a few nuclei here. The tectum, it involves 4 nuclei that come together to form the corpora quadrigemina, so quad meaning 4, makes up this tectum. So it's part of what's called a colliculus, or divided into what are called colliculi or colliculus. So we have 2 superior, so on top, colliculi. Those are involved in visual reflexes. They're getting information from the inferior ones we're about to talk about, also from the eyes, skin, and cerebrum. Then the 2 inferior colliculi, again, all 4 of these combined to make up the tectum, is involved in the hearing. We also have a red nuclei of that tegmentum. This helps in unconscious regulation and coordination of motor activities. And then the substantia nigra, this is pigmented with melanin. That gives us our skin pigment. So it's connected with the basal ganglia, or connected to the basal ganglia of the cerebrum, but helps maintain muscle tone and helps coordinate our movement. This is just showing some of those parts. So again, the tectum and tegmentum that are seen here are cerebral peduncle, which is an area here that sticks out. Again, here's that substantia nigra, our red nucleus, and we have some of the cranial nerves coming off of there. And again, here's that superior colliculus that's here. Now, again, a little bit more about the reticular formation. This is a group of interconnected nuclei that are throughout. They play a role in arousal, awareness, posture, pain, and that sleep-wake cycle. And they also help modulate the activity of cranial nuclei in the brainstem to help coordinate swallowing, breathing, and heart rate. All right, now our cerebellum, again, that kind of branched off region, looks like a little shrub. So it's posterior to the pons. The outer gray folded regions are called folia, and then deep internal nuclei are there as well. And then we also have white matter, which is kind of what makes it look like a tree, called the arbor vitae. So arbor is like a tree term. So that's the white matter, and then we have the gray matter called the folia. The 3 main parts of the cerebellum is what's referred to as a flocculo-ocular lobe, rolls off the tongue there. And then we also have the central vermis, and then 2 lateral hemispheres that are divided by what's called a primary fissure, which is like a gap or an invagination, and then an anterior and posterior lobe. So we'll see a picture coming up. Then the cerebellar cortex has more neurons than the entire cerebral cortex, and those types include stellate, basket, granule, Golgi, and Purkinje cells. Now these Purkinje cells, we'll talk a little bit more about them. These are the largest of the central nervous system. They receive about 200,000 synapses, and they're inhibitory. So only the cerebral cortex neurons actually send axons to that cerebral nuclei. And then the cerebellum helps to communicate with other CNS regions through 3 main tracts that make up what are called peduncles. So the superior peduncle communicates with the midbrain. The middle peduncle communicates with the pons, which is in the middle. And then the inferior is going to communicate with the medulla. So that makes sense because they go in order. So the upper peduncle communicates with the upper part of the brainstem, which is the midbrain. Pons is in the middle, so the middle peduncle communicates with it. Medulla is on the bottom, so the inferior communicate with it. Now, what are the functions, though, of all of these peduncles and such? And they're involved mainly in muscle tone and movement, so again, balance, as well as some of the unintentional movements that are regulated here. So again, we're not like jerking and shaking when we're trying to relax, but also have some learning involved in some of those learning motor skills as well. And here's the picture of the cerebellum. So again, we have this flocculonodular lobe that is right in here. Here's our vermis that's there again, and then we have the two lobes. So we have the posterior and the anterior lobes on each side, and then that primary fissure is what's going to separate those. And then again, we have white matter and gray matter. So the white matter being the arbor vitae, that's what gives it kind of the tree trunk looking shape that we see, and then the gray matter being the folia. Now moving into our diencephalon as we work our way up. So this is between the brainstem and the cerebrum. So again, we already mentioned thalamus, subthalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. So here's our diencephalon that we can see here that shows all of these different. So our first picture, we can only see the thalamus and the hypothalamus that are here. But again, we have the epithalamus made up of the forbinulae, and then the pineal gland, and then we also have the subthalamus that all come together to make up this diencephalon. So starting with the thalamus, there are two lateral portions. They're connected by the interthalamic adhesion, which makes sense. This is actually going to be surrounded by the third ventricle. So we're going to talk about some cavities that occur called ventricles. So this is surrounded by that third ventricle. And the thalamus is mainly the sensory relay center. So again, it's connecting the brainstem to the brain or the cerebrum. So all the sensory information, except for some smell synapses, are going to come from here. So all of our motor functions, our moods, our emotions, and sensory innervations, all of that sensory input goes through the thalamus. The subthalamus is just inferior, so sub meaning below that thalamus, so it's involved in controlling motor function. The epithalamus, again, epi means on the outside, so it's a little up and over, so superior and more on the outside, or posterior to the thalamus. Again, it has the two parts that I mentioned in our pictures, so the habenula. This is the motivational control of behavior, so it helps motivates us. It's part of our limbic system we'll talk more about, part of the basal nuclei we'll learn more about, but also the regions that are involved in behavior and reward. Therefore, addictions come a lot and are involved a lot with this region. And then the pineal gland, that small little gland that sticks off the side there, this is involved in our sleep-wake. So melatonin is going to be secreted and released here. And then finally, our hypothalamus is the most inferior, so hypo meaning really low. So we have sub and then hypo. So this has what are referred to as mammillary bodies, which are vulges here. These have olfactory reflexes, which is our smell, but also some emotional responses to odor as well. And then the infundibulum is the stalk extending from the floor, but it connects to the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus helps regulate the pituitary secretion of hormones. And that's going to then regulate a lot of other functions in body and regulatory functions of the brain. So the hypothalamus helps to receive and coordinate sensory input from internal organs. So again, whether we're full or not, taste receptors on the tongue, come back to the limbic system, but also the nipples, external genitalia, and the eyes. So again, all of the diencephalon is this huge sensory relay system, and each part kind of is involved more, some more with smell, some more with eyes, coordination, that type of thing. Okay, and then the tracks of the nerve fibers and the nerves going, again, extend to the brainstem and the spinal cord. They move through the infundibulum to the posterior pituitary, and then cranial nerves are also going to be involved here that control swallowing and shivering. So it's important in the regulation of mood, emotion, sexual pleasure, satiation, which is our hunger or not, rage and fear. And then input from the eyes, so the think about the optic system to this suprachiasmatic nucleus helps to determine rhythms of our light-dark cycle. And this is kind of summarizing some of the different functions of the brain. Now, I'm not going to ask specific functions like that are listed over here, but just understanding all the hypothalamus does a lot. So it has autonomic, it has reflex things we don't have to control, like heart rate and that type of thing. Again, endocrine, talking about the pituitary and releasing hormones from it. We have some muscle control, like our swallowing, regulating our body temperature is through the hypothalamus. Again, that hunger and water intake. Our emotions are also regulated here. That sleep-wake cycle due to that pineal gland. And then also sexual development and behavior. So lots of things happening there in that little hypothalamus.